We're on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, and we're up to Mistavra. The first word in the line is Mistavra. It's about a little bit more than a third down on the Daf. Mistavra, which, if you take a look, for example, if it's a frame of reference, Tosas Dibra Maska V'Lema, and you drop down about 10 lines in that Tosas, you'll see the word Mistavra. Now, the Gemara is trying to figure out why we exclude the possibility of a nephew being miyabim, the wife of his uncle. Because the Torah says, Yeshru achim yachdav. So the word achim appears in the parsha of Yibum, and the word achim appears in the parsha of Lot, which we're going to read in Mitzvah Shem a day after tomorrow. And it says there, Vayomer Avram el Lot, Alna tehi meriva beini uveinecha, ubein ro'ai ubein ro'echa, ki anoshim achim anachnu. He's describing his relationship with his nephew. So Avram is speaking to Lot, and he calls Lot and him achim. We are brothers. So the word achim that appears here in the parsha of Yibum also appears in the parsha of Lot. And there it's referring to an uncle and a nephew. So perhaps we should derive from the word achim that there's a mitzvah of Yibum to be miyabim, the wife of your father's brother, meaning Haran is the father of Lot, who's the brother of Avram. And now Lot would have to be miyabim Sarah, the wife of his uncle Avram. Gemara answers, Mistabra, mi b'nei Yaakov havilin. We saw in the case of b'nei Yaakov that at the end of Sefer Bereshis, Shnei Masar anachnu achim b'nei avinu. Achim, again the word achim. So we have the word achim in Lot, and that's referring to an uncle and a nephew. We have the word achim in Yaakov, with the Bnei Yaakov who share the same father. They don't share the same mother necessarily. They are called achim, and we have achim in Ki Yeshru achim yachdav in the parsha of Yibum. And the Gemara says we have a pressing reason to give precedence and define achim in Yibum from the achim of Bnei Yaakov rather than from the achim of Lot and Avram. Why? What's the malusa that points us in the direction of the Achim of Bnei Yaakov, who say Achim Anachnu? And the answer is something called Nifne or Mufne. Now, this is a technical rule in the laws of Gzeira Shavah. And if all things are equal, the first rights, so to speak, to Gzeira Shavah are granted to a pasuk that's mufne. The word that we want to isolate for the Gzeira Shavah could be omitted. For example, in the case of Achi Yaakov, Shnei Masar Anachnu, I'm going to skip a word deliberately, B'nei Avinu. We are 12 sons of our father. So why did it have to say Shnei Masar Anachnu Achim B'nei Avinu? The word Achim is totally redundant. Mishum b'mifne, mafne. Midahavil l'michtav Shnei Masar Avodecha B'nei Avinu. B'nei Avinu, it could have said just B'nei Avinu. I mean, B'nei Avinu would indicate that we are brothers. So why do you have to mention that we're brothers? Uksiv achim, nevertheless, the Torah adds the word achim, shmami no lafnuye. Lafnuye means it's sort of available for a drasha, for Gzeira Shavah. Now, I'm going to ask a question later on. I'm not so sure about the word achim in the parsha of Lot, but right now we're going to assume that that's what Avraham Avinu had to tell Lot, that we are achim, and therefore we should come to some compromise. You turn to the left, I'll turn to the right, and we'll split. So the Gemara thinks that in the case of Lot, the word achim is necessary for pshuto shel mikra. Therefore, it's not mufne, cannot be used for Gzeir Shava. Therefore, we prefer the Bnei Yaakov. Now the Gemara takes a look at all these drushes and wants to know why we need all of these drushes. Itzrich lemichtav achim, itzrich lemichtav yachtov. Right? The pasuk says, "Ki yeshvu achim yachdav." So we have achim and we have yachdav, and we need both. And what we're going to do, and this is a typical structure of the Chaklatari Gemara, when you have two psukim, we're going to see what happens if we have the first pasuk and justify the second, and then we're going to go back and ask, why do we need the first pasuk? Why do we need the second pasuk? We already had the first, back and forth. Why do we need both psukim? In other words, one pasuk alone would always leave us in the dark. Ikas of Rachmana Achim. If in the parasha of Yibum, the Torah would have sufficed by saying Achim, then Hava Mina, we wouldn't be absolutely convinced that we can derive a Gzeir Shava from the Bnei Yaakov. But rather, Lelif, why don't we derive Yibum in Gzeir Shava, Achva Milot? Which means that there's a real serious Havamina now that a nephew would have to be Miyabe, the wife of his uncle. Now that contradicts the Gemara that we just learned a minute ago. And if you'll tell me there's no Havamina that we would choose to learn Achim in Yibum from Achim in Lot, when we have Achim in Bnei Yaakov, why? The Lo Mafne, because the pasuk of Achim in Lot is necessary, it's not redundant. Lie means it's not so. Afnuye Mafne, which sounds like the Gemara is now retracting its original position, and now is postulating that even the word Achim, in the case of Lot, is mufne, it's unnecessary. So now the Gemara is going back to the drawing board, re-examining the pasuk by Lot, ripping it apart, so to speak, word by word, to come to the conclusion and prove that the word Achim in the pasuk of Al Not Tehi Mariva Beini Veinecho Bein Roai Bein Roechi Ki Anoshim Anachnu Achim Anachnu, that word Achim is mufna, it's extra. Why? The pasuk could have said and should have said Anoshim Reim. Reim means friends. Uksiv Anoshim Achim. Why did the Torah choose Achim? After all, the whole pasuk is about Reim. Al Not Tehi Mariva Beini Veinecha Bein Roai Bein Roecha Ki Anachnu Reim Anachnu. Okay, the truth is, maybe I went a little too far, and I'm retracting what I said. It actually, when it says Ro'ai, it doesn't mean Reim. Ro'ai means shepherds. But in any event, the word in Tanakh, the appropriate choice for friendship, is not Achim. Achim are biological relatives that share the genetic code of their father. It should have said Reim, because what Avram is trying to convey to Lot is that we're on good terms. We work together. We know what Avram was willing to do for his nephew Lot. And therefore, let's find an amicable solution to the problem that your roim are encroaching on mine and the grazing areas and so forth and so on. So Reim would have been the appropriate choice of the word. Uksiv, but nevertheless it says Hanoshim Achim. Why the extra word Achim? Maminol Afnuye. And therefore, we now in this Havamina would say that the word Achim, redundant or inappropriate, so to speak, imprecise, in the case of Lot, is coming to teach me Xer Shava to Achim and Yibum. And therefore, a nephew has to be Miyabim, his uncle's wife. Therefore, Koser Rachmana Yachtov. Now we need the extra word Yachtov. Hamiyuchadim ben Nachla. Now here's the deal. The word Yachtov, if you recall from the Gemara above, here on this Amud, is telling me that there's an overlap, an equation between Yibum and Nachla. Those two are equal. And that's going to teach me that Achim, Yeshu Achim Yachtov in the Parsha of Yibum, is the same Achim who will inherit their father's estate when their father dies. In the case of Ben Achiv, the son of his brother, he doesn't get a portion in the Yerusha. Again, for this we'd have to learn Perek H Nochel. But when we say Nochlin Biyachad, they split the Yerusha, that's two brothers that share the same father. But an uncle and a nephew did not split the Yerusha. So if there's an uncle whose father died, he will be the sole exclusive Yoresh. He's the heir, and he will not share it with his nephew. He'll share it with a brother, but not with his brother's son. And this will shed a light on the word Yachtov in the Parsha of Yibum to exclude an uncle and a nephew. Why? Because Yachtov means Miyuchadim Lenachla. And that excludes an uncle and a nephew. Okay, fine. Now let's ask the reverse question. You've told me why I need the word Yachtov, and Achim would not be sufficient. Ki yeshu Achim Yachtov. I need not only Achim, but I need Yachtov, because Achim could have meant an uncle and a nephew, as we saw from Lot, and that pasuk of Achim is Nifnuyeh. Now I need Yachtov to teach me that Achim means literally two brothers that share the same father, as opposed to an uncle and a nephew. But let's go the other way around. What if the Torah would have said Yachtov and left out the word Achim? Because of Rachmana Yachtov, what piece of the puzzle would we be missing? And how would we be in the dark if the Torah had not added the word Achim? Havamina, I would have thought that maybe if the Torah didn't give me a generic word Achim, meaning the scope, and the application of the word Achim is much broader than Yachtov. How so? Havamina de biyachte the Abba uve'ima. Perhaps when the Torah says Yachtov, and Yachtov means miyuchadim, like we saw miyuchadim lenachla, I would say it's miyuchadim in the fact that these two brothers are full brothers, both maternal and paternally share the same father and mother. That's the Achim that the Torah addresses in the Chiyuv and the mitzvah of Yibum. But what happens to two Achim that share the same father, but they do not share the same mother? Perhaps if I didn't have the word Achim, I would not know to include a brother who is not both a paternal and a maternal bracha in the mitzvah of Yibum. Tzricha. Now I need the Gzeir Shava of Achim to the Bnei Yaakov. The Bnei Yaakov shared the same father, but not necessarily the same mother. And there the Torah uses the word Achim. Right? Shnei Masar Achim Anachim. So we are called Achim. And from that, we shed a light on the Achim of Yibum, that Yibum applies to two Achim that don't have the same mother in common. They have only the same father in common. So the Gemara is not happy about this. Why? After all, even in the absence of a Gzeir Shava, why would we assume that in the case of Yibum, we require both a common father of these two brothers and a common mother as well. After all, Yibum benachla tola rachmana. We know that there's an overlap, a mirror image between the laws of Yibum and who is the Yavam, and the laws of Nachla and who is the heir. The Torah says in the parasha of Yibum, Yakum al Shem Achiv, that the child born to the Yavam after he fulfills the mitzvah of Yibum is called on the name of his late brother. Well, maybe it means we give him the same name. I don't know. We'll find out about it. In any event, the Gemara later on, we haven't gotten to Daf Chav Daled, the Gemara derives the conclusion that none of the other brothers, other than the Yavam, will inherit the estate of the late brother. So imagine Reuven dies, he leaves an estate, and he's got a brother Shimon, a brother Levi, etc., etc. Shimon is miyabing the wife of Reuven, and the Torah says, Yakum al Shem Achiv Hames, which means that the Nachla, the estate, is inherited exclusively by the Yavam. Again, the brothers will fight it out who is going to be the Yavim, and we'll see the sugyas of the oldest and so on and so on. And the one who actually does the mitzvah of Yibum, he inherits his brother to the exclusion of any other brother. The other brothers will not share in the Yerusha. So now the Gemara asks the following question. Since there's an absolute equation between Yibum and Nachla, such that a Yavam is a Nochel, he himself as a Yavam, being Mekayim Mitzvah Yibum, he inherits his late brother. Within the context of that equation, then we certainly would know that we don't require Achim Mina Avu Mina Em, because in the case of Nachla, a brother will inherit his late brother's Nachla, even if the two of them share the same father but not the same mother. Nachla Mina Av Velo Mina Emi. Nachla applies to brothers Mina Av. They will inherit one the other. But Aim, the fact that they share a common mother, is Lomayla V'Lomorid. It's irrelevant. Let's say you had two brothers that were maternal brothers. They would not inherit each other because there's no law of inheritance through the mother. It's all through the father. So the Gemara now has to justify this Hamamina that you need a brother who has both the same father as the Niftar, as the one who died, and the same mother. Why would there be such a Hamamina? The mitzvah of Yibum depends upon the law of Nachla. I need the Gzeira Shavah to teach me that you don't need, that the Bnei Yaakov did not share the same mother, and that's enough to be called Achim in the parasha of mitzvah Yibum. Salkid, I would think, Hoil, V'chidushu, Dika Mishtrei Erva, Legabe. In the parasha of Yibum, there are two chidush. One is the mitzvah of Yibum, and the other is the matir to remove the erev of Eishasach. If not for Yibum and that mitzvah, there would be an Isur erev of Eishasach, Karetz. Now the Torah would want to limit the application of Yibum and restrict it to certain situations to the exclude of others, in order not to be matir the erev of Eishasach. Very interesting. We're caught in a very fine tightrope situation. Which way do we turn? On the one hand, we want the mitzvah of Yibum to be fulfilled. The Torah has vested interest. L'hakim shem li'achiv hames and so on. On the other hand, you're being matir the erev of Eishasach. We're not so excited about that. And therefore, as a Havamina, we would have limited the scope of and the application of the mitzvah of Yibum and excluded a case where two brothers have the same father but don't have the same mother. We're going to need Bnei Yaakov with the Gzeira Shavah to teach. Is Ad V'Yachte V'Abba V'Ima. The Torah is not willing to be matir the Isur Erva V'Eishasach for the sake of Yibum unless it's a case of both maternal and paternal. Kamash Malan, that's why Tzricha, I need the Gzeira Shava, Achim to the Bnei Yaakov. So it's interesting. The Havamid is willing to break the mirror image, the connection between Nachla and Yibum. If we would have gone straight with that equation, Lahakim Al Shem Achim Ames, which means Nachla, and the mitzvah of Yibum applies whenever Nachla would apply, then certainly in a case where they are brothers with the same father, they share the same common father, that would have been enough both for Nachla and for Yibum. So there'd be no need for the Gzeira Shava to derive from Bnei Yaakov that even if they share the same father, not the same mother, there is a mitzvah of Yibum because that's called Ach. And why would we limit Yibum in a way that's not limited to Nachla? So that you have the general definition of Achva for Nachla, but when we get to Yibum, although again, Yibum is going to impact on the laws of Nachla, we're going to exclude the other brothers because the Yavam is the one who gets the Nachla of his brother. And in that sense, Yibum is really a mirror image of Nachla. But we will say that with regard to being Matir and Erevim, we need full brotherhood. Means they have to share the same father. Now, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, the pasuk that we're dealing with in Bnei Yaakov is before the reconciliation, before Yosef reveals himself. Can you check that out for me? If you happen to have a Chumash Bereshis and Beis Lamed Beis, and it could be that since at that point Yosef had died in the minds of the brothers, when they were saying, well, we were 12 and now we're only 11 and so forth and so on, they were implying something about the mitzvah of Yibum. And they were saying that even if Yosef is not a brother because we share the common mother and father, nevertheless, we're still brothers and we will fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum if we find Yosef was married. Yeah, Yosef was 17, he was not married at that time, but in theory, if we locate his wife and he has no children, we'll be miyavim. I'm just adding a possibility as to why Bnei Yaakov is going to teach us that even if they are brothers only through the common father, but not through the common mother, nevertheless the mitzvah of Yibum will apply. Obviously, that's derived from Gzeira Shava, so they don't need my explanation. But it might not be just purely coincidental that the Gzeira Shava is learned from this pasuk, because when they were emphasizing that we were all 12 brothers, they were really talking about, in a sense, the potential of the mitzvah of Yibum. And if you learn the parasha of Yehuda and Tamar, you see with Erevim and all that, that the Yibum was an ancient tradition that dated back to the biblical time. All right, now we begin a new sugya, which is called the sugya of Shomeres Yavam, or the sugya, you can call it the sugya of Zika. And the question is, how do we define Zika? A man dies without children, and his wife falls for Yibum. There's a Zikas Yibum. Is that called Ishus? And there's a Hakdama, an introduction here in the Masechet, which I'd like to share with you, or at least highlight it, that's going to introduce the sugya that we're about to embark upon. There's going to be a sugya later on Daf Mem Aleph that really bears and sheds light on our sugya here in Yud Zayin, and that's a machlokas tanoim as to whether or not the Yavama through Zika is considered married, so to speak, an ishus to the Yavam. Now, what was the case that the Tanoim were arguing about? There was Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi brothers, and they, or two of them, I should say, 2 out of 3 of them, married Rachel and Leah, respectively, meaning 2 sisters. Levi marries Rachel and dies without leaving any children. So Levi's wife, Rachel, now falls b'yibum in front of Reuven and Shimon. Now, at this point, in the sequence of events, there should be a mitzvah yibum when Levi's wife, Rachel, falls b'yibum to Reuven and Shimon. The only problem is that Reuven was Makadesh Leah, the sister of Rachel. So it's not exactly the case that I mentioned before, where 3 brothers, 2 of which married 2 sisters. That's not the sequence of events. That's true, bottom line, because after Levi married Rachel, then Reuven, so to speak, married Leah. Now, the very moment that Reuven marries Leah, the sister of Rachel, Rachel becomes Achos Ishto. And there's no way that Reuven could be Miyavim Rachel, who is the Almana of Levi, because in this case, Rachel is Achos Ishto of Reuven. However, Shimon is in the clear. Shimon is not married to his sister Rachel, and therefore when Rachel falls to Yibum, Shimon can be Miyabim. And the Mishnah records the following machlokas. First, we'll begin with Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, Yesh Zika. What does that mean, Yesh Zika? Reuven is not allowed to marry Leah. Why? Because there's a Zika between Rachel and Reuven. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira defines that Zika as an ishus, as if there's a marriage relationship. It's such that Reuven cannot marry Leah because Leah is the sister of, in quotation marks, his wife, Rachel. Again, she's not his wife, but she's the Yevama that fell for Yibum to Reuven as well. And Zika creates a kind of quasi-ishus between, in this case, Rachel and Reuven, and therefore Reuven cannot marry Leah. Now, Reuven had gone ahead and married Leah. He wasn't asking any questions. But she's Asura because of the Zika Sibum that he has to Rachel. In other words, how could Reuven be married to Leah, who's the sister of Zekukaso, Rachel, which means that she's like Achos Ishta. Now Shimon goes ahead, he's Miyabim Rachel. So that Zika is completely gone, replaced by a full-fledged ishus between Shimon and Rachel. Is now, at this moment in time, Leah becomes Muteris to Reuven. Because as we said before, the marriage between Reuven and Leah was illegitimate because she was Achos Kukaso. There's no Zika anymore because now Shimon was Miyabe and Rachel, the Yevama of Levi. Once Shimon does so, the Zika is gone. It dissipates into thin air. Now, Reuven's marriage with Leah, the sister of Rachel, becomes a legitimate marriage. Now, apparently there are Tanoim who disagree. He says we're not sure who these Tanoim are. They're anonymous Tanoim. And we're trying to understand what is the opinion of these anonymous Tanoim. How did they, or in what context, why did they reject Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira? So I'm going to take a stab at it. And please check me out. John, you have the Masechet to see if you can find either a yay or a nay to what I'm about to say. The Tanoim who reject Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira will not accept the opinion that the marriage relationship between Reuven and Leah was illegitimate from the get-go. They never bought on to the definition, I should say the identification of Zika as Ishus. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira had an equation, Zika equals Yishus, and therefore, since Rachel is Kuka to Reuven cannot marry Leah, her sister. And the Chachamim did not buy into it. That was Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira's unique position. Again, it would seem that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira admits that when Shimon is miyabim Rachel, then it's okay. At that point, the Isser between Reuven and Leah is paka because now Leah is no longer achos kukas. But up front, from the get-go, Reuven was enjoined from marrying Leah because Zika equals Ishus. And I'm going to suggest, but again, I might be wrong, that the Tanoim did not agree with that premise that Zika equals Ishus that would generate a prohibition on Reuven from marrying Leah because it's achos Ishus. Now we go on to another Mishnah. Until now, we've been discussing a Mishnah in Yevamot on Daf Mem Aleph. Now we're looking at a Mishnah in Nedarim Daf Ayin Dal. And the question is, in the context of Zika, meaning of Shomeres Yavam, does the Yavam have the right to be Mefer Nedarim? We know the Torah in Parshas Matos tells us, establishes that a husband can be Mefer and void his wife's Nedarim. Do we view Zika in the same way as we view Ishus? And in this case, the Yavam could revoke the Nedarim of his Zkuka by virtue of the equation between Zika and Ishus. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yefer es Nidorel. The Yavam has the absolute rights of a husband to revoke the Nedarim of his wife. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, in Yeshno Yavam Echad Bilvad Yafer, in Yesh Nayim Eina Mafir. Fundamentally, Rabbi Yeshua agrees to Rabbi Eliezer's position that Zika is Ishus and therefore generates a Hafaras, in this case, not a Baal, but a Yavam. However, he stipulates and restricts the application of that halach of Hafaras Nedarim to the case where there's only one Yavam. which means that according to Rabbi Yoshua, you can view Zika as Ishus if there's only one individual who's vying for Yibum. There's only one candidate, only one brother. There was Reuven and Shimon. Reuven died and Shimon is left. But if there's Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, then we cannot consider Zika as an Ishus because it's impossible for her to be married to both Shimon and Levi. Not because they're brothers, because she can't be married to two people. Now, Rabbi Eliezer had said, Yefres Nidorel. He didn't qualify. He didn't mention, well, because it's only one Yavam. It would seem that Rabbi Eliezer would extend the rights of Hafaras Nidarim and the equation between Zika and Yibum, even to the case where there are many brothers. And now we have a third time, and that's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says there's no right to the Yavam, granted to the Yavam to be Mefer in the Nidarim of the Yavama, and it doesn't matter even if he's the only brother alive, because Ein Zika. Now it's hard to know what Ein Zika means. We're going to see a whole bunch of other Tanoim that agree that Ein Zika. What does that mean, Ein Zika? The whole Masechet Yevamot is predicated on Zika. And I would suggest that Ein Zika, this particular sheet of Rabbi Akiva, and we said that many Tanoim agree with Rabbi Akiva, is a halacha in Hafaras Nidarim. Right? We have various levels of issues. We have Erisin, we have Nesuin, we have a lower level, which is called Zikas Yibum, and that doesn't register on the Richter scale of Hafaras Nidarim. For example, I'm not sure what Rabbi Akiva would say, what would he would hold if you asked the question as to whether Reuven could marry Leah when Rachel falls to Yibum. Could be in that sense. Rabbi Akiva would consent to the view of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira that Yesh Zika, which means that Leah is Achos Ishto. But as far as Hafaras Nidarim is concerned, Ein Zika Quinterly. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Shomeres Yomim Shemesa Mutter Be'ima. So we have the case of Reuven and Shimon that are brothers. Reuven, let's say, in the case here, he gives that Shimon marries Sarah, who's the daughter of Rivka. Shimon dies without any children. Sarah falls to Reuven for Yibum. And she's called the Shomeres Yevamot. She's waiting for Reuven to be Miyavim. Shemesa. Sarah dies before the Yibum could take place, before Chalitza could take place. Mutter be'ima. Reuven is allowed to marry the mother of Sarah. Now, a person is not allowed to marry the mother of his wife even after his wife dies. But the answer is that the Yavama, even though there was a Zikas Yibum, is not considered his wife. And this opinion and this ruling of Rav Huna Amar Rav would seem to reflect the position of Ein Zika, which we identified as Rabbi Akiva's position, that a Shomeres Yavam who took a neder, her Yavam cannot be made for his her nidara because Ein Zika. How would this impact on the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira and the Chachamim as to whether or not, in our case, Reuven could marry Leah when Rachel fell for Yibam to Reuven? And we said that according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Yesh Zika, and therefore Leah is considered Achos Ishto, and Reuven is enjoined from marrying Leah, at least before the consummation of Yibam. The Tanoim rejected that. They held Ein Zika, and Reuven Laissez-faire has free rights to marry Leah. He's not married to Rachel. Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, would seem to support that opinion of the Tanoim that rejected Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and Rabbi Akiva, who rejected the opinion of both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and completely excludes the Yavam from Hafaras Nedarim. And that applies even if he's the only Yavam, because Rabbi Akiva holds Ein Zika. So the Gemara says, Alma Kasav Ein Zika. So far, so good. I mean, that's exactly what the conclusion that we want to derive from Rav Huna in the name of Rav. Then in the case of a Shomeres Yavam, if she dies, then the brothers can marry her mother. There was never a marriage relationship, an Isha's relationship with the brother, so he can marry her mother. So lema halacha kidivrei omer ein zika. Should we now derive a far-reaching conclusion la halacha based on this tradition of Rav Huna in the name of Rav, of mutar be'ima, that ein zika? Now, why is the Gemara so upset about it? I mean, after all, we have the Chacham who rejected Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. We have Rabbi Akiva in the case of Hafaras Nedarim, that he excludes Hafaras Nedarim. So we have plenty of Tanoim to stand on their shoulders and bolster and strengthen this view of Ein Zika. Why is the Gemara so up in arms here? Alma Kasav Ein Zika. Okay, fine. Now, I would like to suggest, and we'll see if I can fit this into Rashi, that the Gemara is not asking about the acceptability or lack thereof of maintaining la halacha, the position of Ein Zika. That wasn't bothering the Gemara. Okay, Shmami no Ein Zika. Well, what's the cash? But the Gemara is worried about a certain, shall I say, linguistic methodology. The Gemara is worried about the language. In this case of Rav Huna in the name of Rav. Lema. Lema means Rav shouldn't have told me that, yeah, the Yavam is allowed to marry the mother of the Yavama if the Yavama dies without Yibum. Forget about that. Just tell me Ein Zika. I'll know how to derive the conclusions and apply the principle. We've seen a machlokas in different sugyas that revolves around yesh zika or ein zika. Just tell me, Rav, halacha, ein zika. That's the lema. And I think the import of the lema is that perhaps I can hold ein zika with regard to Hafaras Nedarim and marrying the sister of the Yavama, but yet I would still think that he's not allowed to marry her mother. Meaning, Rav is being machadesh a particular application of the general rule of Ein Zika. And that application we wouldn't have known about. If Rav would have used the terminology, halacha ein zika, period, ein zika. Hava mina hani mina betray, aval b'chad yesh zika. We had already a precedent in the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua with regard to Hafaras Nedarim that we should distinguish between case A, where there's only one candidate Yavam, and case B, where there's more than one candidate Yavam. And Rabbi Yeshua will grant, in case A, the rights for Hafaras Nedarim because he's the only Yavam, and then we're going to apply the principle of Yesh Zika. But in the case where there are multiple Yevamim, then there's no Hafaras Nedarim because ain't Zika, but Yesh Zika in the case where there's only one Yavam. There's only one brother. There's only Reuben and Shimon, and Reuben died, and Reuben's wife falls for Shimon, and exclusively for Shimon. In that case, Shimon has a Zika relationship. So what would happen if Reuben and Shimon are the only two brothers, and Reuben dies? Can Shimon marry Reuven's mother? Can Shimon marry Reuven's wife's mother? We'll call it the Shviga. Why? Because in this case, we have a compelling logic to conclude that it's us. And Yesh Zika will apply. And Yesh Zika means, in this case, that even if someone's wife never dies, he's not allowed to marry her mother, even after the death of his wife. It's not like a chosnish. And if we assume that in a case where there's one Yavam, there is a Zika Ishus relationship, then with the death of, what was her name, Sarah Bas Rivka, with the death of Sarah Bas Rivka, this one single Yavam would be enjoined from marrying Rivka, the mother of Sarah, because we would apply Yesh Zika. And Rav wants to tell Shomeres Yavam in all cases, even if there are only two brothers, meaning that now there's only one Yavam in the death of one brother, then Mutar Be'ima. And we're not going to apply the principle of Yesh Zika in the case of one Yavam, which was Rabbi Yeshua's position in the Sugya Nedarim Ayin Dalet, that if there's only one Yavam, then we will plug in Yesh Zika. He could be made for a Nedarim, and therefore we would think he's not allowed to marry in the death of his wife, the mother of his wife. Kamash Malan, Rav makes an absolute sweeping statement with no ifs, ands, or buts that Shomeres Yavam Shemesa Mutar Be'ima. There's no need to be machmir here because Ein Zika, even in the case where there's only one Yavam. So now the Gemara is still hung up, so to speak, on the linguistics issue. And so, the lema, why shouldn't Rav have said the following? Halacha k'divrei Omer ein zika afilu b'chad la b'chadach b'achad. Meaning, except the sheet of Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Akiva says that even if there's only one candidate Yavam, nevertheless he doesn't have rights to be made for Nedarim because ein zika. So it means ein zika even b'chad Yavam. Chadach. Why didn't Rav just say Aloha Rabbi Akiva? From that we would have understood everything. And that would mean, by the way, that Rabbi Akiva, if we accept his halacha, we now could paskin that it's mutter for Reuven to marry Leah, who's the sister of the Zakuka, Rachel, because Ein Zika, even if Reuven is the only candidate for Yibum. So the Gemara answers, Omar, if Rav had said, Achi, namely halacha, ki Rabbi Akiva, hava mina, afilu michayim, Kamash Malon, Li'achar Misa in Michaim Lo. Right, let's go back to the language of Rav. Shomeres Yavam Shemesa Mutter Be'ima. Only after the Shomeres Yavam perished, she passed away, then and only then, says Rav, will we permit Ruvain to marry Rivka, the mother of Sarah, the mother of the late Yevamot. But if the Yevamot is still alive, then even Rav agrees that Ruvain, the Yevamot, is not allowed to marry her mother. Now, why not? Again, if you're saying ain't Zika, what difference does it make whether the Yevamot is alive or not alive? There's no Zika relationship between Sarah Bas Rivka and Reuven. So what's the reason for Anis? Why can't he marry her mother? Ishum di asa levatel mitzvahs Yevamot. Whoa. In other words, if Reuven marries Rivka, the mother of Sarah, at that point he has closed the door on the mitzvah of Yibum. He has actively uprooted and made impossible Yibum. Because once he marries Rivka, there's no way under the sun he could ever marry Rivka's daughter Rachel. I'm sorry, what was her name? Sarah. Sorry. Get the names right. Is therefore Rav says Shomeres Yavam, we'll skip one word, Mutter Be'ima, that's Shemesa, means Sarah died. And it was never Yibum. After the death of Sarah, when Yibum, the door is locked, is closed on Yibum, then Mutter Be Rivka Ima. Now we're going to allow Reuven to marry Rivka. But if Reuven would marry Rivka during the lifetime of Sarah, which means that Sarah fell for Yibum to Reuven, and now Reuven closes the door on Yibum by marrying Rivka, meaning the mother of Sarah, that's prohibited. That's called Bittul Mitzvahs Yibum. Now, I would ask the following question. What do you mean by Bittul Mitzvahs Yibum? The Torah allows for Chalitza. The Torah did not obligate the Yavam in an absolute way to be Meyabem the Yevamot. The Torah itself recognized and offered an opportunity to get out of Yibum. So why is that called a Bittul Mitzvah when he marries her mother? Do you have any footnote there, maybe, perhaps? Because I have no note here in the Masechet. Okay, I mean, if you find something, let me know, because usually when there's no note in the Masechet, you're not going to do any better in the Heilige Dr. Arts. But, there are exceptions. We've seen in the past where the Art School filled us in and enlightened us where the Masechet fell short. As you know, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Masechet, but nothing. Okay? Maybe it'll come up in the Sugya. I don't know. But this question about Asur Levatel Mitzvahs Yevamot, I mean, why is it any worse than Chalitza? You know what? Let's take a little break and look in the Yalkut Biurim. Maybe by chance in a million, we'll see something in the back here in Yalkut Biurim. Where are we? In Zainam and Beis? Yeah. He says the following. This is on the bottom left of Kuf Lamed Zayin. Kuf Lamed Zayin. He quotes Rashi, Imu Noseis Ima, right? If Reuven will marry Rivka, Harei Mevatel Legamri, it's mitzvahs Yibum v'chalitza. Kasur Rishonim, let's see if this is relevant to us. Keinu Leman Diomer Ein Zika, which means that he's allowed to marry Rivka after the death of her daughter Sarah. Shemishum Shezikasa Grua. Interesting. This is a little bit similar to what we said before. It's impossible to say Ein Zika. What do you mean Ein Zika? The whole Masechet Yevamot and the mitzvah of Yibum is predicated on Zika. But Ein Zika means it's a Zika Gemura, a Grua, like Malacha Grua of Hotzah. V'chein Mucha, Azikasa Grua, Arein Ifteres Af Michalitza. Hey, Mucha to be a Gemara Lahalon, Sober Ein Lo Chalitza. Rak Laman Yom Yesh Zika, Ein Kiddushi Achosa Mafkim Es Zikasa. Here we're talking about Ima, but again, the same thing should apply to Achosa. And I need Tzricha Chalitza. He writes here on the next page, Ha'olami Devrem Shedafkel Mani Yomein Zika Mispateles Mitzvahs Yevama B'Kiddushay Krovasa V'Lamani Yom Yesh Zika Mutal Lekadishes Krovosea V'Ein Bazeh Mishum Bittul Mitzvahs Yevama. Why? Because she still needs Chalitza. V'Ikshar Sameach Ol Af Lamani Yesh Zika V'Adei Nifkas Zikasa Min HaTorah Al Yidei Kiddushay Ima V'Ein Choletzes El Midrabbanan. Kosev came a rashba biatz came aflidi day a reu mevatel mitzvahs yevamot min haTorah. Came lama hutzach litchok for litlos es iser bittel mitzvahs yevamot. I'm still not 100% on board. One thing I gained from this discussion, that if you hold Yesh Zika, then this is not called Bittul Mitzvahs Yibum because he has to give a Chalitza in any event. But if you hold Ein Zika, once he marries her relative, her mother or sister, then there's not going to be any Chalitza. The whole Mitzvah of Yibum is completely gone. So that means that Zika is so weak, even though it generates a Mitzvah Dorais of Yibum, that if you remove that Zika, then by marrying a relative, then there's no Zika at all. The Zika completely disappears. Really interesting.
If they're brothers.
If there are other brothers. Yeah, right. We're talking about a case where there's only one brother. Right? And we're saying that even though there's one brother, it's still Ein Zika, which means that he can remove that Zika entirely, completely. There won't be any vestige of that Zika when he marries one of her relatives. And she doesn't need neither Yibum or Chalitza, which is really mind-boggling. When you think about it, she fell for Yibum. There was some sort of Zika, and now it's completely gone. It's really interesting. That's called Ein Zika. And once you take a Zika and you remove it completely, and there's no vestige of that Zika, then that's called Bittul Mitzvahs Yevamot. I don't know if that's a Doraisa or it's a Rabbanan. But we're not going to allow the Yavam to marry one of her relatives, of the Yevamot's relatives, while she's alive. After she's gone, then obviously there's no Mitzvah Yibum, there's no Bittul Mitzvahs Yibum. But as long as she's alive, and as a result of marrying her relatives, the Mitzvah of Yibum is completely gone. There's no Zika, there's no vestige of any sort of Zika, no Chalitza. we're holding a zika, and therefore he's mevatel the mitzvah of Yid. Okay, then, so let's just make a note of where we got to. Let me see where we got up to here. Just a second. Is Hamamina Dafka Michayim Kamashwan. Second, where are we up to? Where do we get up to? Oh, Ihavia Amar Hachi. Then Abamina Hanimili Bechad Abavitrena. Verha. So I think we're up to the ha. Maybe we got a little bit beyond that. Let's take a note of that, and a note here. Okay, then so basically we'll pick it up on Yom Rishon on Daf Yud Ches. Although we still want to read the last line on Yud Zayin Amid Beit. Okay, so we didn't need this. That's a little bit of a miracle. Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm very curious about the name business, right?
Yeah.